The flight deck of the USS Valiant glowed under the harsh weight of the floodlights, every surface shining with wet steel and sweat. Steam hissed from the catapults in thick white bursts, rolling across the deck before vanishing into the night. Crewmen in colored vests moved quickly but with practiced rhythm, their shouts drowned out by the howl of turbines and the crack of jet blast deflectors locking upright. One by one, A-18s screamed off the bow, afterburners blazing, the roar shaking through every plate of the carrier's hull. To anyone standing on the deck, the sight was a ritual of controlled chaos, dangerous but orderly. To Nova Reyes, strapped into her standby jet and left idle, it was nothing but exile in plain view. Hours earlier, she had walked into the ready room expecting to fly. Her name had been listed on the initial launch schedule, her aircraft fueled, armed, and prepped. She had studied the strike package and memorized her role without hesitation. She was a pilot, with more carrier landings than most in her squadron, a reputation for aggression tempered by precision. Yet when Commander Richard Vaughn stood at the front of the room with the clipboard in hand, his tone was flat and final. He told her she would not fly. Her logged night flight hours in the last quarter had not met the threshold. It was a technicality, nothing more. But he delivered it with the kind of satisfaction that suggested the rule had been waiting for the right moment to be enforced. Nova had asked once, voice even, why the squadron data had not been reconciled weeks earlier. Vaughn had not looked up from the clipboard. Regulations are clear. Hours logged are hours logged. You'll remain in reserve. She had clenched her jaw, offered no reply, and walked out as though the decision carried no weight. Inside, the dismissal cut deep. She knew she was ready. She knew the roster change was less about hours and more about politics, maybe even personal calculation. But on a ship where the chain of command ruled every moment, protest was wasted breath. Now, strapped into the cockpit of her Hornet, helmet balanced in her lap, she listened to the launches as each catapult fired another jet into the night. Her visor caught the HUD glow that reflected faintly from the instrument panel. Green numbers and symbols she was forbidden to use. Out on the deck, crewmen walked past her without looking. They knew she was grounded, knew she was armed and ready but not cleared. Their silence was worse than open pity. It was the silence of procedure, of people too used to watching competence set aside for red tape. Steam washed over the canopy, smearing her view for a moment before the wind carried it away. Nova kept her breathing steady, fingers resting lightly on the throttle, never moving, but always ready. Every vibration of the deck, every scream of turbines down the line was a reminder of where she should have been airborne, with the strike group. Instead, she was held down by the ink of Vaughn's pen, a single cross-out mark on the launch roster. That clipboard had been her sentence, as final as any verdict delivered in a courtroom. The image stayed with her, her name, neatly lined, then struck through, replaced by another pilot who had never flown half the hours she had. The roar of another launch shook through the fuselage. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over her, then opened them with the same calm restraint she had practiced since stepping off the ready room deck. Defiance simmered beneath the surface, sharp and unyielding, but it held inside where no one could see. The deck belonged to protocol tonight. Instinct would have to wait. The cockpit felt like a cage of light in the darkness. Green symbols pulsed across the radar screen, each sweep painting the void beyond the carrier's protective circle. Nova Reyes sat motionless in her standby jet, helmet now pulled on, her gloved hand tapping idly at the console, in rhythm with the soft ping of the scope. Outside, the night was filled with mechanical fury, turbines whining and deck crews shouting against the wind. Inside, it was quieter, the ping cutting through the background noise like a whisper no one else seemed to hear. She had been watching out of habit, knowing her aircraft was fully armed even if it was officially grounded. Then the faint return appeared, a flicker, almost too light to notice, trailing low over the sea. At first she thought it might be surface clutter, the ocean playing tricks with the beam. She adjusted the sweep, toggled filters, and narrowed the range. The blip held. It crept forward in a slow arc, faint but consistent, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of the net. Her throat tightened. She keyed the radio. Valiant. This is Reyes. I have a contact bearing 087, low altitude, range approximately 60 miles. Possible inbound vector. Her voice stayed steady, but she knew how it would sound to them. Another pilot, grounded and restless, reading ghosts into static. On the bridge, Operations Officer Lieutenant Mark Holloway leaned toward his display. He hesitated before answering. Reyes, repeat your bearing. She gave it, slower this time, spelling out every number. A pause followed. Then Commander Richard Vaughn's voice cut in, clipped and dismissive. Negative contact. AWACS has no picture. Likely sea clutter. Hold position. Nova stared at the scope. The blip remained, faint but deliberate, moving in a way random noise never could. She toggled again, cross-checked against different frequencies. Each pass confirmed it. This was not clutter. Her pulse quickened, though her voice remained level. Contact is holding steady. Recommend investigation. Silence lingered on the net, broken only by the hiss of static. Then Vaughn spoke again. Recommendation noted. Stand by. His tone carried the weight of finality, the same tone he had used in the ready room when crossing her name from the roster. She sat back against the seat, eyes locked on the screen. The ping repeated, faint but undeniable. She thought of how easily such things were ignored, lines written off in logbooks, anomalies discarded because they did not fit the expected pattern. Somewhere above, in the briefing space, she imagined Holloway making a small note, no anomaly. That phrase would bury everything if command chose to believe it. Yet the vector advanced, creeping closer with every sweep. She was the only one who saw it for what it was. Isolation pressed in harder than the cockpit walls. The strike group was out in hostile skies, the carrier vulnerable, and the one pilot who recognized the threat was chained to the deck by bureaucracy. Her fingers tightened on the throttle. Her eyes never left the ghostly trace. The contrast between the roar outside and the faint whisper of the radar seemed almost cruel. Everyone else trusted the noise, the reports, the absence of warning. She trusted the whisper. She trusted what her instincts told her something was coming. On the bridge of the USS Valiant, the air felt thick with hesitation. Screens glowed dimly, painting pale light across tired faces. Voices overlapped, none of them confident, each weighed down by the fear of choosing wrong. Lieutenant Mark Holloway leaned closer to his console, his hand hovering near a pen that never touched the paper. The clearance logbook sat open in front of him, the line for Nova Reyes blank, the ink waiting for a signature that would not come. Commander Richard Vaughn stood rigid with his arms behind his back, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. The faint trace that Nova had reported was too irregular for him, too much like clutter. He preferred certainty, the kind that left his name protected in after-action reviews. She is reading noise, Vaughn said, voice low but hard. No AWACS confirmation, no cross-check from secondary systems. We will not scramble another launch without verification. Holloway opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders stiffened. Around the room, officers murmured, some in agreement, others too cautious to oppose. The weight of the unsigned logbook sat between them like a verdict already rendered. Out on the deck, the atmosphere was different, but no less tense. Steam rolled across the surface, glowing under the alternating red and green lights that signaled to cruise but meant nothing to Nova as she sat strapped into her jet. Her canopy glass caught the glow. Colors, flickering across her face like signals no one would deliver. Her hands rested on the throttle, steady and unflinching. Every muscle in her arms braced for the possibility of motion. The deck crew noticed. Men and women in vests slowed as they passed, eyes cutting toward her cockpit. No one raised a hand. No one spoke. The signal wands that usually carved bright lines through the air hung useless at their sides. Procedure told them she was grounded. Instinct whispered that she was already halfway gone. On the bridge, Holloway finally spoke, his voice tentative. "Sir, if she's right, the strike group could be exposed on their return." Vaughn's eyes narrowed, a man unwilling to acknowledge the possibility of being wrong. If she's wrong, she launches without cover, wastes fuel, and we invite chaos on this deck. We are not gambling on shadows. He turned away, closing the debate with the authority of command. The room fell into uneasy quiet, the glow of screens marking time with every sweep. Back on deck, silence thickened. Crewmen shifted on their feet, waiting for an order that never came. They looked at Nova with something between fear and respect. Her presence was a challenge in itself, a living reminder that the decision lay in human hands, not just in data streams. She did not move, did not signal, but her stillness carried weight. The sound of turbines from another aircraft vibrated through the deck, but around her, there was no motion. The carrier, that was normally a storm of direction, had become a stage for hesitation. The unsigned logbook remained open. The wands stayed lowered. No one cleared her, but no one stopped her either. Between bridge and deck, the ship held its breath. In that pause lived the conflict that defined the night red tape against instinct, procedure against the gut feeling of the only pilot who saw what others could not. The system had chosen paralysis. Nova was already deciding whether to break it. The decision came with no signal and no warning. Nova Reyes slid her visor down, the glow of the HUD catching in the curved glass like a reflection of the choice she had already made. Her fingers closed around the throttle, firm and unshaking. The deck crew froze as if sensing it before she moved. Their wands stayed lowered, their mouths stayed shut, but their eyes tracked her canopy in silence. She eased the throttles forward, engines responding with a rising howl that drowned out the last fragments of hesitation still hanging over the flight deck. Steam hissed from the catapult track, curling white against the glare of the floodlights. Nova's jet rolled forward, guided by her own will alone. Protocol demanded signals, checks, signatures in ink, but she ignored them. She had lived her life in the rigid lines of procedure, but tonight she severed herself from it. As the launch bar locked into place, she pushed through the canopy the image of Vaughn's clipboard. Her name struck out. She knew that Mark had defined her in the eyes of command. This launch would define her in truth. On the bridge, Commander Richard Vaughn spun toward the deck feed, his face lit in sharp planes by the screens. "She cannot launch without clearance," he barked, but the words carried no force down to the steel below. His officers looked on, uncertain, none moving to relay a stop. The logbook remained unsigned, but signatures could not stop turbines once they screamed awake. Holloway's jaw tightened, eyes flicking to the display that tracked her jet. He said nothing. The hesitation of command became the silence of acceptance, and Nova filled it with motion. She pushed the throttles to military power. The engines roared, rattling the canopy as heat shimmered across the deck. Catapult crews stood aside, hands frozen at their sides, the ritual broken but unstoppable. Nova pressed the button, afterburners igniting with a violent flash. The deck lit orange for an instant, the glow mirrored in her visor and her eyes. Steam erupted around her, boiling upward like smoke from a bridge she had just set aflame. The carrier that had refused her now hurled her into the night. The G-force slammed into her chest as the catapult fired. Her body sank hard into the seat, vision narrowing to green HUD symbols over black sky. Floodlights vanished in an instant, replaced by the infinite void. The noise of the deck dropped away. replaced by the muffled roar of her engines and the sharp tone of her instruments. She exhaled once, long and steady, as the black ocean stretched beneath her like a silent witness to the break she had made. For the first time that night, she felt free. On deck, crewmen watched the trail of fire fade into the dark. Some looked in awe, some in fear, but none moved to raise alarms. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar that had come before. They all knew what had happened. One pilot had stepped outside the chain, and no one had chosen to stop her. Steam still curled where the catapult had launched, like the last trace of a tie cut clean. On the bridge, Vaughn's anger boiled, his hands gripping the edge of the console as her icon blinked alive on the radar feed. His voice was sharp, full of fury, but powerless. Get her back. Now. No one moved to act. The truth lay in motion. She was gone, already part of the sky, already carrying the fight beyond his reach. Holloway lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet Vaughn's eyes, unwilling to admit what both men knew. She was right to go. Nova leveled her jet, the ocean vast beneath her, the horizon invisible. Adrenaline surged through her blood, but with it came calm clarity. There was no going back. She had defied the red tape, severed herself from the ink of bureaucracy, and chosen instinct instead. Out here, above the silent sea, there was no signature that could stop her, no clipboard that could erase her. There was only the dark, her jet, and the threat she alone had chosen to meet. The ocean below was nothing but blackness, no horizon, no moon, only the faint shimmer of starlight broken by the glow of Nova Reyes's HUD. The green lines flickered across her visor, painting symbols that refused to stay steady. Her radar struggled against jamming, every sweep filled with static, every lock dissolving as soon as it formed. She adjusted filters, narrowed the beam, forced the machine to show her what she already sensed. The faint contact she had seen from the deck was now ahead, darting in and out like a phantom. She leaned forward, body tense, as if closing the distance by sheer force of will. Her warning receiver screamed suddenly, a sharp tone cutting through the helmet's muffled air. She banked hard, the control stick jerking under her grip as G-force pulled at her body. A streak of light flashed across her canopy, a missile tearing past and vanishing into the void. She steadied her breathing, heard the rasp echo inside her mask, and rolled into a counter-turn. A silhouette flickered in the starlight, just long enough for her to squeeze the trigger. Missiles streaked away, white fire against endless black. One found its mark. The explosion lit the night in a sudden bloom, then died as quickly as it came, leaving only the emptiness of the sea below. One hostile, destroyed. The second moved in immediately. Her HUD flickered, struggling to pin the contact, radar warbled, lock symbols collapsing into ghostly static. She switched to visual, searching for movement where none should exist. The jet came at her out of the dark. Barely a shadow. She yanked the stick back, the aircraft groaning as the frame strained against the maneuver. Another missile tone screamed. She dropped chaff, the glowing flares scattering like falling stars before being swallowed by black. The hostile passed close enough that the rush of displaced air shook her jet. Instinct carried her hands, not data. She rolled inverted, pulled through, lined the silhouette for a heartbeat. Her missile tone flickered green. She fired. The enemy broke hard, missile missing by yards. Her fuel alarm began its steady beep, reminding her how far she had already pushed. Sweat beaded under her flight suit, her chest heavy with the press of G's. She pulled through another turn, her vision narrowing to the thin circle of HUD lines and the shadow she refused to lose. Her breathing came shallow, controlled, the only sound beneath the constant buzz of radar warning. She chased him into a dive, ocean rushing closer, though she could not see where water ended and sky began. At the last second she leveled, vapor trails peeling off her wings, and pulled behind him. Instinct told her where he would be, Not the machine. The HUD flickered again, a shaky lock forming. She fired. The second explosion came lower. A flare of fire reflected briefly on the black sea before fading. Silence returned as if nothing had happened. Only the beeping fuel alarm and her own ragged breath reminding her the fight had been real. Her jet rattled under the stress of every maneuver, gauges dropping lower, systems strained to the edge. She steadied her grip, eyes locked forward into the void. She had destroyed them both, but she was alone, nearly dry, with miles of dark ocean between her and the carrier. The flicker of her HUD, the brief trails of fire against endless black, and the silence that followed became her proof. No one else had seen what she had seen. No one else would believe it until the records confirmed. She had trusted the mirage, and instinct had carried her through. The lights of the USS Valiant rose out of the Black Sea like a floating city, glowing in the distance. Nova Reyes steadied her grip on the stick, every muscle aching, the low fuel alarm cutting through her helmet in steady, merciless beeps. Her gauges told her what she already knew: there was barely enough to make the deck. Each mile stretched like a lifetime, her jet shuddering with every adjustment, systems running on fumes. She whispered the words into the radio. Calm, but absolute. Valiant. Low state. Emergency recovery. The channel hissed back in silence. No voice answered. Ahead. The strike package and cap returned at the same time, dark shapes crossing her path as they lined up in the night pattern. Their formation looked sharp, orderly, everything she had been denied. She cut straight through it, no fuel to spare for pride or ceremony. If command wanted her gone, they could write it in ink later. Right now, the deck was the only truth that mattered. The carrier grew larger in her canopy, deck lights glaring bright against the dark. She dropped the hook and felt the shudder as it extended. Her heart beat in time with the alarm, a steady drum under the scream of turbines. Still no word from the tower. Still no clearance. And yet, the deck moved. Crew shifted into position, steam curling around their boots as they readied the wire. The silence said everything command could turn their backs, but the men and women on the steel would not. The jet hit hard, wheels slamming the deck. Sparks flew as the hook caught, the wire stretching taut before snapping her to a violent stop. The jolt rattled her bones, helmet slamming back against the seat, but the machine held. Steam rose up in sheets, swallowing the canopy in a white blur. She pulled the throttles back, breath steady, listening to the turbines wind down. For a moment she sat motionless, the silence around her louder than the crash of impact. The canopy opened to the night air, the smell of salt and jet fuel flooding in. Crewmen stood still, watching. No one cheered, no one saluted. They looked at her as though acknowledging something unspeakable, the kind of act that could not be written down in a log. The deck chief stepped closer, eyes meeting hers through the glass, and gave a single nod. Nothing more. It was enough. She climbed down slowly, helmet still in her hand, sweat cooling on her skin. Her boots touched the steel, the deck vibrating under the rumble of another jet taxiing in. Commander Richard Vaughn walked past without a word, his expression carved in stone, unwilling to look at her but unable to erase what she had done. She held the helmet against her lap, the visor still reflecting the deck lights that had hurled her into the sky hours earlier. The crew parted around her as though she carried a gravity all her own. The night swallowed the sound of turbines. The beeping fuel alarm finally silenced with the engine shutdown. All that remained was the hum of the carrier and the quiet weight of what had been risked and survived. She stood alone on the deck. No applause, no recognition. Only silence. Heavy and absolute. The truest acknowledgement she would ever receive. The briefing room aboard the USS Valiant was washed in harsh white light, the kind that revealed every crease in uniforms and every mark of fatigue. Screens on the walls replayed the night's events in green and amber lines, radar traces frozen into neat arcs that made chaos look almost clinical. Two hostile signatures blinked out at the edges of coverage, the only proof of the fight that had happened far from the ship. Around the long table, staff officers scribbled in logbooks, their pens scratching steadily, recording a version of events already pared down to procedure. Nova Reyes sat at one end of the table, back straight, helmet set beside her chair. Her face was calm, almost unreadable, though every tick of the projector traced the memory of what she had lived through. In front of her, a folder stamped in red ink carried the single word, unauthorized. That mark had already fixed her actions into the system, no matter what the data showed. She kept her hands still, folded loosely in her lap, while the weight of that word pressed down harder than the G-forces she had endured the night before. Commander Richard Vaughn stood at the head of the table, his voice clipped, each word measured. He acknowledged the confirmed kills, noting that the radar trail matched her report. Yet even as the data proved her right, he never let the tone shift. Her launch remains outside clearance. He said, regulations were bypassed. We cannot allow instinct to replace procedure. Formal reprimand is under consideration. Court-martial remains possible. His words landed flat, without passion, like a verdict already carved in stone. Lieutenant Mark Holloway glanced toward Nova, then looked quickly away. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, the smallest signs of conflict etched into his posture. He had seen the anomaly when she reported it, and now he knew the truth as well as she did. But no words came from him. Respect showed only in the silence he maintained, a silence that spoke louder than agreement with Vaughn could. Around the table, others avoided her gaze entirely, their pens moving, their eyes locked on paper rather than the pilot who had kept the strike group alive. The projector shifted, showing her jet's path arcing away from the carrier, a single line breaking from the neat formation. It looked like defiance, a curve against the clean geometry of procedure. To her it looked like survival, the proof that instinct had mattered when the system faltered. No one said it aloud, but the image stayed there, a quiet reminder that what had been written off as unauthorized had also been the act that saved them all. The meeting ended without ceremony. Folders closed, pens capped, chairs scraped back across the floor. Vaughn left with the same rigid posture he had carried in, authority untouched by doubt. Holloway lingered a moment, then followed, his eyes lowering as he passed her. Nova did not move until the room was nearly empty. She reached out, tapped the red-stamped folder once with her fingertip, and then rose. The ink said unauthorized. The data said otherwise. Between those two truths, she stood alone. The dawn broke slowly over the Pacific, turning the horizon into a faint line of gold that stretched across the endless water. The floodlights on the flight deck dimmed as the first natural light crept in, soft and fragile against the steel. Nova Reyes sat alone, beside her jet, helmet resting in her lap, the visor catching the glow of the rising sun. Her hands traced the edge of the shell absently, feeling every scratch, every mark, left from years of launches and recoveries. Around her the carrier stirred back to life, engines spooling in the distance, deck crews moving in steady rhythm. Yet she remained apart from it all. She thought of her call sign, the word that had followed her through squadrons, ready rooms, and whispered jokes. Nova. It had been given in mockery, a dig at her volatility, a reminder that she burned bright and fast, too explosive for comfort. They had meant it as a warning label, not as a title. Yet now, in the silence after the night's chaos, she understood it differently. A Nova was violent, yes, but it was also light in the darkest sky. She had burned through the void, found what no one else had seen, and left brilliance where only shadow had been before. Deck crew walked past, carrying wands and tools, their eyes meeting hers for only a second before moving on. None spoke. Words were unnecessary. The silence carried more weight than applause ever could. It was not command's recognition she felt here, not the cold stamp of approval in a logbook. It was the quiet acknowledgement of those who had watched from the deck, who had seen her choose instinct over ink. They said nothing, because nothing needed saying. A junior pilot slowed as he passed, his helmet under one arm. He gave a single nod, small and deliberate, before continuing toward his aircraft. Nova returned it with the barest tilt of her chin, eyes steady on him until he vanished into the bustle of the morning launch. The gesture was brief, almost invisible, but it carried the respect that Vaughn's clipped words would never give. She held it in her chest like a truth only she and a handful of others would carry forward. The first jet of the morning roared down the deck, afterburners blazing, leaping into the sky. Nova watched it vanish into the pale light, the sound fading until only the hum of the ship remained. She turned her gaze back to the horizon. Calm now. The storm inside her settled. The night had proven her right, but there would be no ceremony, no medal, no record. All that remained was the meaning she had taken back for herself. Nova. Once an insult, now a name forged in fire and silence. She sat with it quietly, letting the sun rise, her truth undeniable.